We know people are afraid. We know they have many concerns and questions. This is a unique virus with unique features. This virus is not influenza. We are in uncharted territory. We have never seen before a respiratory pathogen that's capable of community transmission, but at the same time, which can also be contained with the right measures.
It's not being called a pandemic yet, but the World Health Organization is telling countries to prepare. Hi there and welcome to Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Kapelos. The coronavirus is continuing its rapid spread around the globe. According to the WHO, in the last 24 hours, there were almost 9 times more cases reported outside China than inside China. The number of cases worldwide, look on your screen there, it's more than 89,000. More than 3,000 people have died. The virus has spread to 67 countries. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Dominican Republic are among those which confirmed their first cases today. There are now 27 cases here at home in Canada, but fortunately no deaths. In the U.S., though, 6 people have died, all in neighboring Washington state. The rise in cases has increased awareness as well. Over the weekend, Canadians can be seen stockpiling food, medicine, and other household supplies. Here in Ontario, 3 new cases were reported just today, bringing the total in the province to 18. Health officials, though, say they actually expected a higher number at this point.
When we expanded out to our wider number of countries, someone asked me what was I expecting to increase. I was predicting we'd see about 20 to 30. So to see these numbers is, for me, is oddly enough, is reassuring. It tells me that the system is working, people are coming forward, people are being seen, and people are being assessed in that way. And that's the crux of our whole way. That's how we do it.
Canada's top doctor, Theresa Tam, is less optimistic than her Ontario counterpart when looking at the entire country. In a teleconference today, she described the number of cases in Canada linked to Iran as very concerning, and she's advising Canadians to avoid non-essential travel to that country. Same goes for the northern region of Italy and, of course, China. Meanwhile, fears are growing this outbreak could tip the global economy into a recession. G7 finance ministers are holding an emergency conference call tomorrow to discuss possible measures. That includes Canada's finance minister. Meanwhile, markets did rebound today from historic losses last week, now that action from world central banks appears more and more likely. The Bank of Canada faces a rate decision this week. So should it cut rates? What else should Canada be doing to protect its economy from the effects of the coronavirus? John Manley was Canada's finance minister during the SARS outbreak. He joins me now in studio. Hi, Mr. Manley.
Hi,
thanks very much for making time. So you were finance minister during SARS. That had an impact on Canada's economy. Fast forward all these years later, and China is much more significant when it comes to the world's economy. What do you think the potential impact of this is here?
It is a different circumstance altogether because of the impact of Chinese supply chains on virtually everything that we buy. And sometimes people don't realize it, but it may not say made in China, but it may have some components in it that were made in China. That goes through our clothing sector, through our industrial sector, our automotive sector, the parts that go into automobiles that are made in Canada, that go into the North American supply. A lot of that comes from China. And, we just don't know how long this is going to last. SARS was a little different. SARS was, what we experienced was very targeted in Toronto. We had the biggest impact there, and the impact was largely in the tourism sector. So that it was a matter of trying to restore people's confidence that this was under control. I remember we had a cabinet meeting in Toronto during the crisis, and Prime Minister Chrétien went for lunch at undoubtedly an Italian or a Greek restaurant somewhere in order just to say, look, it's okay. We can be out and about. Not everybody's coming down with SARS. This one is still in its developing phase. And I think the anxieties that people are feeling about these community-based infections is going to grow before it begins to decline.
And I wonder also, just because so much of the SARS effect was specific to Canada, this we're seeing, as we said in the introduction there, it's really over the past week, the rise in the number of cases outside of China spread, to so many different countries like Iran, Italy. The impact is very global right now. And I'm wondering your impression of how that might hit the economy too.
Well, I think that's an important point, and also the fact that it is spreading to countries that are less well developed. I mean, quite frankly, Italy has a Western health care system. It has the European Union to provide stimulus. It will get through this and back on track. I expect it has the capacity to deal with it. But when cases as they have spring up in Africa, in less developed countries where they just simply do not have the capacity to contain this, then I think there's lots of cause for worry, not so much on the supply chain issue, but on the fact that this begins to spread in an uncontrollable way.
We saw markets respond to that last week. Huge declines, biggest since 2008. We've seen a rebound today, largely on the news that you're seeing speculation in a number of countries that central banks will essentially use their policy to address it. What do you think in the Canadian context of that? We're waiting a rate decision.
It's important never to spend too much time looking at markets to figure out what's going on in the real economy, but sometimes they're a leading indicator, sometimes they're not, sometimes they miss it altogether. Over the long term, fine, but not over the short term. So I'd say there was a delayed reaction to COVID-19 in the markets. Suddenly, everybody woke up, and that's the way markets are. It's a herd mentality, and they all rushed to the right side of the boat. The boat started tipping over. Somebody said, yeah, well, central banks might weigh in. Now they're all rushing to the other side of the boat. The problem is central banks don't really have many resources left. Interest rates are very low. So central banks are going to require a lot of support from fiscal policy administered by governments, and they're all in deficit. Now, some worry about deficits more than others. Clearly, the United States is comfortable with $1 trillion a year deficit. That sticks in my throat, but because we balance budgets in our time, but even Canada has more limited room to maneuver than would be the case if we were working from a balanced budget looking at this. But that's where the support will have to come from. That's not going to fill the holes in supply chains.
No, and actually I do want to touch on this idea of what levers government has available to them, because as we mentioned off the top, finance ministers, including Canada's, are going on an emergency call. This government is also in preparation for its budget. How do you think that factors into their thinking?
It's a moving target now. Good luck to Bill Morneau trying to figure out what to expect in terms of revenues this year, particularly corporate revenues. And remember, for you and I as individuals, what we make in 2019 is what we pay tax on, unless we have special kinds of income. For businesses in the corporate sector, if they have losses this year, they can roll them back, apply them back to the profitable years going back 3 years. So this can have a big impact on federal government and provincial government revenues if we go into a really serious dip, which it seems like it could happen.
Yeah, I guess what I'm interested in is, because you've been in the role, we're at this sort of odd juncture where we know something's coming, but we don't know the severity of it, and we know it's going to be big, we don't know how big, and we don't know specifically how it's going to apply to Canada. And I'm curious as to how much more difficult that makes sort of figuring out how to respond and then how to budget for the whole country.
Well, I think when you've got a high level of concern, and we saw it post 9/11 for different reasons, and we saw it in the SARS case. The important thing for government to do is to reassure people that somebody is in charge, that measures are being taken. You know, a lot of the time people think government just gets in the way, they spend too much, they waste money, they're a nuisance and an annoyance. At certain points in time, even the most libertarian among us realize that governments actually exist for a purpose. This is the time for government to give reassuring signals, to demonstrate that they are meeting the needs of persons who are affected, that they're dealing with the financial problems that this could cause for communities as well as for individuals, that they're on on the ball, that they're in the game.
And just quickly before I let you go, on that conversation that the finance ministers are supposed to have tomorrow, I'm sure you've been on many yourself, is there any kind of level of coordination that can take place on something like this, or is it more sharing information at this stage?
No, we've seen, well, at this stage, it's going to be, here are the things that we're considering doing. Here's what our experience is so far. Here's where we can help. You know, if Nigeria has a serious outbreak, who's going to provide some support for them, because they will need it. So that I think they can begin to set the stage for that. But we saw, I mean, that's why we moved from the G7 to the G20. But we saw in the financial crisis in 2008 and 9 that coordinated activity by central banks and by governments was critical to getting us through very difficult periods in the global economy. So this is actually, in some ways, it's an opportunity for governments, you know, Canada and China, for example, who have not had a lot of things to talk about in a constructive way, to begin to think about what they can do constructively to work together on something that is of mutual concern.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Manley. Pleasure to have you here as always.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Former Finance Minister John Manley.
We're basing our responses on the best science and evidence available, and we continue to monitor global developments both in terms of health and on the economy.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau there saying that his government is closely watching the increase in the number of COVID-19 cases or coronavirus. G7 finance ministers are set to speak tomorrow on best measures to try and mitigate the economic impact of the outbreak and the potential impact of it on the global economy. Welcome back to Power and Politics with the Power Panel, Melissa Lantsman, Brad Levine, and David Ertel. David, you've sat around a cabinet table, I'm sure at moments when there are kind of various crises, and I'm wondering what you think the sort of anticipation must be like, not only on the health impact side of things, but the potential economic impact of this on the finances of this country, the economy of this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're seeing now is a lot of different governments, provincial, federal, worldwide, are bracing themselves. So if you're a provincial government, for example, now you're preparing, okay, on the healthcare front, what's going to happen? You have to, this changes, we're entering budget season right now. All the budgets, we're going to have the provincial budgets, the federal budget, all these budgets right now are being revised. You have major companies revising estimates. Today, a major hotel chain said, we're going to hold off on talking about our results and our strategy for 2020. We're revising everything. So you have a lot of meetings, international meetings, conventions, shows, whatever, that are being postponed or being revised or hold off. So right now what's going on is what happens if this turns into a real pandemic and a real health issue here in Canada. We've been lucky, so to speak, so far. But at the same time, right now what's happening is all these plans, all politically, economically, are all on hold. And there's that elephant in the room that prevents everybody from making real decisions moving forward.
That's interesting. That's exactly what Dick Pound, we had Dick Pound on last week, who's a member of the IOC.
My guy.
He literally said that it's the elephant in the room every time they're meeting to discuss the Olympics, sort of like, we don't even know if this thing, I'm paraphrasing, but we don't even know if this thing's going to go ahead. And that's kind of always what we have to talk about type of thing. Melissa, what do you think the potential impact of coronavirus is here?
Well, I think we don't know the impact, but I think that we assume that it's going to hit us harder than it has hit us already. The problem is that you have a minority government in Ottawa, and minority governments are really, really expensive. And they'll spend more money than necessarily that they have in the past. And that doesn't necessarily provide the cushion that you might need to weather, even a short-term economic storm. And I think that for the government, the most valuable currency in a crisis situation is trust and competence. And I think that they've fallen down lately on both of those markers. And I'm not sure that it gives Canadians the confidence in us being able to weather any kind of economic downturn that comes from this.
Yeah, let me just quickly follow up. Do you mean fiscal capacity to do so? Like, are you talking about the deficit specifically?
The deficit, for sure, fiscal capacity to do so, but in terms of having any ability to withstand this, we haven't heard the government necessarily communicate. Or when we have, we went from 0 to 60. We went from a minister saying everything's okay to stockpile food. So I'm not sure that they themselves know the impact.
I'll play devil's advocate for a second, because I also read that headline and thought, wow, all of a sudden Minister, because we've had Minister Ahadu on, a dozen times it feels like, and she wasn't saying that. And so I was surprised by that headline too. And I did a little I looked into the scrum that she had, and she was asked questions that prompted that. Like she said, well, should people be doing this? And her response was actually, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm going to paraphrase, but it was basically like that stuff you should normally be doing in the winter. Like don't go, she was cautioning against a major, everybody panicking and stockpiling everything. I take your point. I'm just saying that it wasn't exactly the way
there seems to be
framed it.
A real lack of conditioning in terms of getting from this wasn't a problem to, hey, this may be a problem. And I think we're seeing that on the economic front as well.
What do you think, Brad?
Well, I think there's at least three categories that are worthy of note. The first one is that Canada will weather this crisis better than other countries in the world because of our healthcare system. That doesn't mean that all of our healthcare systems are going to be up for the challenge, which we do not know the full extent of just yet. But I'll be looking for in the budget in a few weeks, the federal budget, a real emphasis of working with the provinces and provinces working with local authorities to ensure that Canada's public health is at the ready. And if we have to borrow in order to do that, then we should do so. But I believe that those jurisdictions that have kept their public health budgets up and kept personnel at the ready and have kept protocols in place when we didn't have this, will serve their residents much better than those who have cut because of short-term ideological reasons. Secondly, this Trudeau government's communication strategy is bad. At every turn this panel, we've talked about how bad these folks communicate, whether it deals with something as serious as this or it is not. They're going to have to get a lot better at their communication strategy, because as is being said on the panel, Canadians are taking their cues from leaders, and they have to be pitch perfect when it comes to allaying fears and ensuring that people are prepared. We don't need runs at Costco on things like masks and toilet paper. That is not going to condition Canadians for this. The third bucket, of course, is the economy. The Bank of Canada is going to be announcing, its rate on Wednesday. It is likely going to be wanting to ensure that the coronavirus's economic impact on the domestic economy is taken into consideration when they look at what the rate will be going forward. But because Canada is a trading country, because we have global supply chains, this is going to have a huge impact on the economy without any question. It's going to have an impact. China's GHG emissions are down, is it 23% over the last little while? So this is going to have a tremendous impact on Canada as a trading nation, and that's going to mean a lot of adjustment. Looking forward to it. But of course, I know my conservative friends will be busy getting their lawn signs ready for an election in October when the rest of the country is going to be getting prepared for this crisis. I think to Melissa's point, and it's interesting, as all three of you are communications expert, I do feel a palpable shift in the last week among the level of concern that people have. Like, this is something that people are really talking about, and I think that they are genuinely worried about its potential impact as we sort of sit on the edge of our seats waiting to see, does it get declared a pandemic? And I'm wondering, to Melissa's point, David, what you think that means for the government's communication strategy. It does feel like they haven't necessarily acknowledged that level of concern at this point.
They haven't. There's a disconnect right now between how the government is communicating on this issue and how the people on the ground. You hear the phone-in shows on radio. You meet people on the street. There's something going on, and people are concerned, even though there may not be a rational reason for it. It's there. So the perception is there, and you have to address it as a government. And I'm going to make a link with the blockade situation. Why does this government not have independent players that are respected in both fields, like an expert in Indigenous relations, come in and manage this? Why can't we have, in this situation, in the coronavirus situation, have health experts brief us on a daily basis.
Well, to be fair, they do, at the provincial level they do.
Yeah.
They do with Dr. Williams in Ontario, for example, and Dr. Tam has a phone conference every day. That
we're not getting this in Quebec.
Yeah,
I'm telling you, we're not getting. I'm not. I'm just.
I see what
I'm
you're
not
saying.
monitoring the rest of the country as closely as you are.
Yeah.
I'm more focused, obviously, on the Quebec situation, but from the federal government and the provincial government here, we're not getting that type of daily information, daily briefs. And same thing on the blockade question. Why don't we have senior, experienced people that are maybe out of politics that know these issues, both on the health side and on the Indigenous side, come in and explain? And because it's just saying it's complicated is not enough. You have to reassure, you have to lead, you have to make sure people understand. People are intelligent, they can understand complex things. Talk to them regularly. They have to be reassured and brought in, not kept out of the loop.
Well, we'll be watching because I don't think this topic is going anywhere for the next while. Thanks to all three of you for your insights tonight in the discussion. Appreciate it as always. Thanks to our power panel, David Ertel, Melissa Lantzman, and Brad Levine. So could the growing outbreak tip the global economy into a recession? G7 finance ministers are holding an emergency conference call tomorrow to discuss possible mitigation measures. Meanwhile, markets rebounded today from historic losses last week now that action from world central banks appears more and more likely. Here's President Donald Trump speaking about this just last hour.
I'm sure the Fed is looking at it. I hope the Fed is looking at it. They should be, but a lot of these central banks are looking at it for stimulus.
Here at home, the Bank of Canada faces a rate decision this week. What might they do, and what kind of economic impact should Canadians expect from all of this? Avery Schenfeld is the CIBC's chief economist. He joins us from Toronto. Brian Kingston next to me is the vice president of international and fiscal issues at the Business Council of Canada. Hi to both of you. Thanks very much for making time this evening for us. Brian, I'm going to start with you because we do have sort of a report out today that outlines the potential economic impact globally of what we are seeing unfold with respect to coronavirus. What does it tell us?
Yeah, so the OECD came out today and they dramatically slashed their outlook for the global economy. They expected it to grow around 3% this year. They're now saying it's going to grow around 2.5%. But there's a big caveat there because that forecast is based on this essentially being contained. In the event it's not contained and we continue to see cases spring up in countries around the world, they're estimating that growth will be cut down to about 1.5% this year, which is a dramatic downgrade from just a matter of weeks ago.
Mr. Schenfeld, with respect specifically to Canada, the OECD offers some analysis about the potential impact on this country and sort of mitigates it a bit by saying that our economy is less integrated than others with China. What is your assessment of the potential impact on this country's economy?
So it's true we're not as tightly tied to China as, for example, Australia is. But nevertheless, we export oil and the world price of oil has dropped because of the global growth concerns. We are tied in with the U.S. and we're seeing a creeping number of cases and local transmission within the U.S. So I don't think we can pat ourselves on the back and say that we're going to avoid this, which is why I think the Bank of Canada is looking at cutting interest rates. Even if it hits some parts of the economy, an interest rate cut might give a lift to other parts of the economy where people are still spending, and that might help cushion the blow, but there is going to be a blow.
What's your sense, Brian, of what the bank might do this week?
Yeah, I think they're going to feel pressure to cut, to the point that was just made. China is far more important to the Canadian economy now. When you look at our intermediate inputs into products that we send abroad, 10% of those come from China, those imports. So that's having an impact, and we're going to feel it now over the next month as factories in China have been closed for, now we're talking about 3-4 weeks. So this is going to pull on the Canadian economy, and I think the bank will be under pressure to cut.
When you look, Mr. Schenfeld, at various sectors of the economy, where are you watching to assess the level of impact this is having?
So I think your viewers will well know, because maybe they've been talking with their travel agents, that people are canceling travel plans. So it's that sort of discretionary spending. I can remember during the SARS episode here in Toronto, we had people not going out for a week or two. So it's that discretionary spending. Exports, obviously, to the rest of the world, which has been slowed already by this. And ironically, the mitigation efforts we do to contain the virus often means that when it starts to hit, we tell people not to go out, not to go to large gatherings. So we're seeing some conferences, for example, canceled. And those all have economic activity associated with them. So while we want to delay the spread of the virus, let it go gradually so our health authorities and our hospitals can deal with it, at the same time, that's going to extend the period where there are economic disruptions.
And what's so interesting, Brian, is that exactly what Avery just described. I was saying that we were talking to John Manley early in the show, and he was mentioning during the SARS crisis, that's very much where we saw an economic impact, right? People stopped going to restaurants. There couldn't be big gatherings anymore. Tourism took a massive hit, but it was very much focused on Toronto, and even by extension, sort of to Canada. We're seeing this virus develop in such a different way that Italy's closed for business right now. Other countries in Europe are closed. Iran, nobody can fly there. If you're coming from Iran and landing in Canada, you've got to self-isolate for 2 weeks, right? Like the impact just seems so much more exponentially bigger.
Exactly. I mean, you have the potential impact in Canada where you'll have communities, if this reaches a pandemic scenario where people aren't going out, they're not going and shopping and buying and consuming. But on a global scale, it's particularly concerning because Canada is a trading nation, right? 1 in 5 jobs depend on exports. And if demand is slowing around the world for the products that we produce, we're going to see a significant impact on Canadian economic growth. And that's what worries me. And I'm also concerned about the potential for protectionism. We know that we've been living through a very protectionist era.
We've already heard it today from President Trump.
Well,
he said this is why you should buy things made here in America.
That's exactly it. We saw this after the financial crisis. There's always a tendency to put up barriers. And of course, we have to protect human health, and that needs to be the first priority. But I do worry that some countries will see this as an opportunity to block exports, and that's damaging for a trading nation like Canada.
Avery, can you help our viewers also sort of dig into a little bit or understand a bit better how the markets play into all this? We had a ton of reaction last week when we saw those markets with historic declines. A lot of people worried about their own personal finances. We see a rebound today. What are your expectations? I mean, it's hard to ask. I'm sure it's hard to answer, but what are your expectations where the market's concerned?
I don't think even though we had this good day for the stock market, we're not out of the woods yet, because don't forget that, particularly in the U.S. market, this decline in stocks came from an all-time high. So we started off with a lot of optimism. We shed some of that optimism. Today, I think the market's reaction was basically thinking that, well, the G7 finance ministers are going to say something tomorrow. The central banks are going to cut interest rates. And there's no doubt that those things will help. Governments can, for example, help pay people who are off work. They can help protect companies that are temporarily under stress. Lower interest rates will keep some spending up, but it's not going to be a cure. The cure is in the hands of the doctors, not the people with economics doctorates. And we're going to need the medical system to come up with treatments and hopefully in a year or so a vaccine.
Avery mentioned the G7 finance ministers call. Canada's finance minister, Bill Morneau, will take part in that. What kind of levers do governments have to deal with this stuff, Brian?
I think the main lever, if it gets to this point, would be some sort of coordinated fiscal stimulus. We know that bank governors around the world have been saying that they're kind of out of firepower here. Interest rates are at extreme lows, and even if there's a cut this week, the impact that can have to really stimulate the economy is quite minimal. So in the event that this goes to where the OECD is saying, and we're talking about 1.5% growth in 2020, you may see coordinated action from G7 or G20 finance ministers to actually pump some stimulus into the economy.
How difficult a decision, Avery, is that right now for the government in this country, just given we're sort of at this odd point where the impact could be very large, but probably by the time, I don't know if they're going to, I mean, the budget is sort of in the process of being done right now, maybe already for the most part done. We're expecting it towards the end of March. Just from a sort of timing perspective, how difficult is it to gauge, okay, how much fiscal stimulus do we put into the economy right now, given we're not exactly sure how big it's going to get, but we got to get this budget out?
I think that's going to be very difficult. And remember that some provinces, Ontario and Alberta, which already released its budget, are still in the fiscal restraint mode. So there's a little bit of limitation there. But governments can do some specific things. So for example, we all talk about, okay, people are going to have to isolate themselves at home. But if you're a waiter, you might not get paid while you're isolated at home and you've got a rent check due. So we might have to, for example, think about amendments to EI payments so that they start right away for people who are forced into self-quarantine. So there may be some actual specific targeted measures that the government could think about getting into the budget sort of at the last minute here, aimed at least cushioning the blow for the people most affected, and even for the businesses perhaps that have to get through this weak period until the clouds dissipate and they're able to recover.
Before I let you go, Brian, how do you think, or when do you think we start to figure out how big the impact of this will be? Is it just basically we got to watch, does it become a pandemic, the spread of it, does it start to ease up? Like, is it until that point, or is it anyone's best guess?
Yeah, at this point, I think we need a few more months. We're only now starting to see, for example, port container traffic at the Port of Vancouver, which is our main trading gateway into China. We're only going to start to see some of the data there and the weakness really in the next few weeks. And because of the lag in shipping times as well from China, it's really difficult to actually gauge the overall impact of this crisis. So I think, give it a few more weeks, and frankly, this is what makes it really difficult if you're the finance minister, you're working in the Department of Finance, trying to set a forecast for a budget in the midst of all of this is no easy task.
I bet. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much to both of you for your time and your insights this evening. Thanks so much to Chief Economist with CIBC, Avery Schenfeld, and Brian Kingston, the Vice President of International and Fiscal Issues with the Business Council of Canada. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.